Once a thriving tourist spot, Crimson Lake now lay shrouded in an eerie silence, with mist hanging over the water like a thick blanket. Its murky depths reflected nothing but the ghostly fog, giving it a surreal and haunting appearance. Locals warned of an ancient curse, a tale as old as the lake itself, whispering about strange happenings and sinister disappearances. But to Eve Peterson, a budding paranormal investigator, this was a golden opportunity. She was drawn to Crimson Lake like a moth to a flame, ignoring the warnings. The legend went like this. Long ago, a man named Silas, a solitary fisherman, lived by Crimson Lake. He was said to be charming, mysterious, and unusually private. But over time, villagers started noticing disturbing changes around him. Animals would fall silent in his presence. Plants would wither where he walked, and then the disappearances began. One moonless night, he vanished, leaving behind a solitary red stain on the lake's shore, rumored to be his blood, hence the name Crimson Lake. With her camera equipment, a flashlight, and her journal, Eve set off to explore the forsaken lake. The mist thickened as she approached, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. She began her exploration at the north end of the lake, where a dilapidated boathouse still stood. Inside, she found broken oars, tattered nets, and rusted fishing hooks, each an eerie reminder of the place's forgotten past. As she clicked on her recorder, she began narrating her investigation. "Crimson Lake," she whispered, her voice breaking the unnatural silence. "Locals believe this lake to be cursed, haunted by the ghost of Silas. But tonight, I'll find the truth." Suddenly, the air grew colder, biting through her jacket. Eve noticed something odd. The temperature drop wasn't gradual. One moment, it was crisp but bearable. The next, her breath was visible. She checked her watch, only to find that its hands had stopped at precisely midnight. Heart pounding, she walked further along the shore. She knew she was being watched. From the corner of her eye, she saw fleeting shadows dancing across the mist, but every time she turned, they would vanish. She brushed it off as paranoia until she heard a faint splash from the lake's surface. Moving closer, Eve caught sight of ripples forming in the water. But there was no wind. She aimed her flashlight, sweeping it across the lake, but the beams seemed to dissolve in the thick fog. Then, a figure appeared, a solitary man in a boat, rowing in complete silence. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and his movements were disturbingly unnatural, stiff as though he was a puppet under an unseen force. Eve's heart hammered in her chest. She could barely whisper, "Who are you?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he lifted his head, and as the flashlight flickered over his face, she saw the empty sockets where his eyes should have been. Suddenly, the mist swirled around her like a storm, blocking her view. She stumbled back, feeling the cold grip of panic closing in. When she looked again, the man and his boat had vanished, leaving only the ripples that gradually stilled. Ignoring her instinct to flee, she pressed on, drawn deeper into the mystery. She turned on her recorder again, her voice shaky. I just saw something, a man on the lake. But he wasn't alive. The forests surrounding the lake seemed to close in as she ventured further, trees stretching like gnarled fingers in the darkness. Branches brushed against her arms and face, like skeletal hands reaching out. She was far from the boathouse now, wandering into the heart of the forest where legends claimed Silas used to camp. It was there, in the clearing, that she found an abandoned campsite. The tent was torn, riddled with holes, and covered in decades of decay. A rusty lantern lay beside it, and inside, she saw something chilling, a faded photograph of a man, with eyes like voids staring into her soul. His face was unmistakable. It was the same man from the boat. As Eve backed away, the silence broke with an inhuman scream, reverberating through the trees. It was a sound so primal, so anguished, that it froze her in place. She couldn't tell if it came from the lake or the forest, but it seemed to echo in all directions, filling her with a dread she couldn't shake. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and she felt a presence surrounding her, a suffocating pressure on her chest. The shadows around her grew darker, forming shapes that loomed closer with every heartbeat. Just as she turned to run, the ground beneath her gave way, and she fell into a shallow pit. She scrambled to her feet, shining her flashlight around, and gasped at what she saw. Bones. Hundreds of bones, bleached and broken, littered the pit. Some were animal, but others were unmistakably human. Her hands trembled as she pulled herself out, but something clung to her ankle, a cold, skeletal hand emerging from the earth. Panicked, she kicked it off and bolted toward the lake. She could feel her pulse thudding in her ears, her lungs burning as she sprinted. But the mist thickened, blinding her, and the cold sank into her bones, chilling her to the core. Just as she thought she'd lost her way, the lake came into view again. Its surface was eerily calm, and she could just make out the boathouse in the distance. Out of nowhere, a voice whispered close to her ear, soft and menacing. "Why did you come here?" She spun around, but no one was there. Her breath hitched, and every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave. She glanced at her equipment, hoping it had captured something, anything, to prove what she'd seen. But when she looked at her recorder, she found it dead, its battery completely drained. Desperation clawed at her. She turned to leave, but her feet felt rooted in place. Her legs wouldn't move, as though the lake itself was holding her captive. The fog thickened, swirling around her in a ghostly embrace, and from within it, she saw him, the man from the lake. His eyeless gaze wore into her, and this time, he spoke. "They all come to me," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo. "Curiosity brought you here, but now you'll stay. Forever." With a scream, Eve wrenched herself free, stumbling backward. But when she looked down, her legs were no longer her own, translucent, fading. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She was becoming part of the mist, her body dissolving into the fog, her scream fading into silence. The next morning, search teams scoured Crimson Lake. They found her camera, her recorder, and her journal near the boathouse, but there was no sign of Eve. The only clue was her last recording, a chilling whisper, her voice barely audible over the static. "Don't come here. He's waiting."